Hello and welcome to Spotlight On. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight is on Kirt Debique, CEO and CTO of SyncFloor, a marketplace of commercial music to be used in advertisements, film, TV, video games, and more. Kirt has lived his life at the intersection of technology, media, and the arts for many years. After over 20 of those years at Microsoft, Kirt spread his wings as a musician, label founder, and now tech startup entrepreneur. It was a joy connecting with Kirt, and I hope you enjoy our talk.
If I close my eyes, I hear a slight accent in your voice. Is it a Caribbean lilt?
Yeah, absolutely. You got it straight right. Yeah, straight on. Yeah, you're good. You know.
So
yeah,
where are you from?
I'm from Trinidad originally. Trinidad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so a lot of people mistake it for a Canadian accent.
That's what I was thinking. I was trying to do the math on your last name. Yeah.
Right. And right, exactly. And as it turns out, you know, fairly typically for the Caribbean diaspora, right? You know, especially, you know, if you think about that East Coast migration, right? You go, you know, from the Caribbean to, you know, Miami, New York, Toronto, London, sort of, you know, heading north that way.
Yeah,
right? And
even
so
Montreal.
I actually have a lot of family in Toronto. And so I'm sure I picked up some stuff from visiting them. You know?
Yeah. What a great city. I love Toronto.
A lovely city. Yeah, it is.
Can you just tell me your story of how you wound up in Seattle?
Yeah. Left Trinidad when I was 16 to go to college. That was in Miami, at University of Miami. You know, did computer engineering there. And coming out of there, I was on my way to grad school. I was heading to Stanford for grad school. And for the summer, I interned at Microsoft. And so I came out here to intern for the summer. About 2 months in, they said, "Why don't you just stay?" And I was like, I could, go to school and starve, or I could stay here and not starve. I was like, I'll just stay here. I like to eat. So I stayed here. And the rest is history. I don't think I ever told Stanford I wasn't coming. So I just skipped out.
Are they still sending you bills?
There's probably some professor there wondering where his TA is or something. That guy never showed up.
So, all right, that's thank you for that. So,
no problem.
You arrive in Miami at 16.
Yeah.
What was that experience like coming from Trinidad to Miami as, by the way, one of the leading undergrad, computer, electrical engineering, computer science programs in the country? Like, how and why there? And can you tell me that story?
Yeah, sure. So as a bit of an intersection of two things, my mom had actually a year before taken my brothers up to Miami. The typical story, right? Seeking opportunity, a better life, that kind of thing. At the time, I could have gone, and I had been recruited on a scholarship to University of Miami, an academic scholarship. And my dad was really concerned about me going to college at 15. The agreement we had was, hey, I'm gonna stay an extra year here in Trinidad, do the first year of what's called A levels, weird British school system, kind of thing, and then go. And so that's kind of we went. So going, I was fortunate to have some infrastructure because by then, my mom and my brothers were there a year. But at the same time, it's really jarring because you entering college at 16, is a bit of a trip, kind of thing, and there are a whole lot of things that you make assumptions about in terms of how you interact with people that are likely a bit off from the reality, both coming as an immigrant and, sort of coming at that young age. That said, I found my people. I ended up working fairly early on in the computer center there, and I was doing computer engineering, and I liked writing code and that kind of thing. And so, and in fact, actually, I remember they were really surprised. What happened at first was the first semester, because I was on a different visa, I couldn't work that first semester. But what I did is I just essentially worked for free in the lab anyway. I'd give people advice. I'd go get printouts. I'd take it back to the back desk. And the guy who was running the center at one point was like, "Who's that guy? Did we hire someone?" They're like, "No, this guy's he's just working for free." He's like, "All right, well, let's hire next semester then." And so then, I started working there. And that was, I think I worked at that center for my entire undergrad.
So in a field not known for diversity, certainly not, I mean, I'm doing a little bit of math, but certainly not 20 or so years ago. What was your experience like? And were you aware of those facts on the ground, and were you made aware of them? Or like, what was the transition like?
I mean, as I think any minority person of color would tell you, you always walk around with a certain degree of awareness of, at a minimum, the micro, aggressions, if you want to call them, that society can put on you. And then, it's certainly like, if you think about like in Miami at the time, right, there are certain neighborhoods that are fairly segregated from others. And we lived in, an area that wherever we could, where our mom could kind of afford to have us be. But you also see these sharp distinctions. Like University of Miami, the campus is in Coral Gables, which is a fairly ritzy area, but like you could literally go across the street from the campus and hit a really, really poor neighborhood, and that happens in various places in Miami, right? So you have that awareness of that. At the same time, you go to school, and especially if you're deep into a major like computer engineering, you're cranking away at whatever you're doing there, and that can become your life in a way, right? So you're kind of really focused in on something. I feel that certainly when I transitioned here, you come, to Seattle, where, in Miami, at least you kind of have, based on immigration, particularly from the Caribbean and Latin America, a fair amount of, diversity along some axis, you know what I mean? And so there's that, but, you come here and there's certainly less of it, at least along the axis that I was coming from. But again, at the same time, you kind of find your people, right? And coming to Microsoft, it's a particular, culture and set of people about what they're thinking about and doing. And so you can get, sort of really deeply engaged in that. I think one of the things that was helpful for me was that growing up in Trinidad, I kind of came from a scenario where I grew up where lots of people, looked like me, right? And so, you bring some of that with you, into whatever scenario you are, even if you're aware of the things that press against that, it gives you, in some ways, a bit of a personality buffer to be yourself. So there's some of that there.
When you were at Miami at the university, were you aware of, and did you come into contact with the music program at all?
Yeah, so it's a great music program, right? And so so the story is really funny. So I was there. I was 16. When I first got there, couldn't drive, et cetera, et cetera. So my mom would come pick me up after school, which, as you can imagine, is a huge confidence builder. If you're
That's pretty cool.
16-year-old going to college. But so where she would pick me up was right outside the music school. And so, and my mom, as being typical immigrant working mom, she was doing a lot of stuff, and so she'd pick me up fairly late. So I'd kind of spend time sitting around the music school, listening to stuff that people were playing, talking to random, music students, etc., for, a couple hours in the evening, just while I was waiting for her to come by.
Yeah.
And so, and it's a great program. It's a great program. I guess I can't say I know, what status it has now, but certainly at the time it was considered one of the better ones.
Yeah, I graduated high school in the late 80s, and the two things I remember about University of Miami was computer science and music.
Yeah, and the medical school was also considered to be quite strong as well, University of Miami Medical School. So.
Yeah, that was very far outside my realm of.
Yeah, like I say, all that stuff was a long time ago, so I couldn't tell you what they're considered now.
Yeah, I was a computer science major, but at a much less prestigious school. I went to Southern Connecticut State University, so. But it's really interesting to think about what computer science was in the late 80s, early 90s. It was such a transitional time. We still worked on mainframes. And,
absolutely. That's right. I did a lot of my, sort of initial coding on like VAX VMS systems and stuff like that.
That's right.
Yeah. Right. And so, it was a very different thing. But, one of the things I felt was true, and I don't know if that was because of where I particularly was working at, but a ton of my experience in terms of what then transitioned into working professionally in software, was all about project stuff and about sort of picking up work and being curious and doing things on your own in a way. Like some of the best ways to learn about that stuff, because it was such a a burgeoning, kind of new thing going on, right, was to just dig in and try stuff out, and so I remember I remember learning C, for instance, because the School of Education commissioned a set of educational games, and they were paying, I think, $3,000 per game. And so me and my buddies were like, "Oh, dude, we got to do that." But they were like, "It's going to be, they have to run on," I think at the time it was Apple II machines, and they had a particular package that you had to use, and you had to use C, and we all had learned Pascal as part of the program, because that's what was the thing that you learned at that point, right? And so we were like, we just said, "Yeah, sure, we know C." We're like, we're gonna get this done. And so everybody took their different approach. I think some people would write it in Pascal and then sort of like translate the core engine to C, whatever, whatever it took. You kind of went after that stuff,
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Pascal. COBOL and Pascal were like were what they were still teaching. And the thing that I wasn't mature enough to make sense of at the time was being told that COBOL was no longer relevant, but we're teaching it anyway. It was such a strange phenomenon. And I remember it being pitched as like, you'll never get fired for knowing COBOL. It was basically the step.
Fair enough.
You'll always be able to get some job.
That's right. There's COBOL code still out there, just waiting for you to maintain it. In fact, didn't we just have an issue with that recently?
I don't know, but it makes me think of Y2K. And I remember explicitly saying to myself at the time, man, I wish I had paid more attention to COBOL.
No, I think very recently there was some program that got overwhelmed with maybe its applications or something like that, and required, like they essentially put out a call saying, like, our systems were built in this really old language. I think it was COBOL, and they're like, does anybody know COBOL?
Wow.
even today, right, kind of thing. It's like, wow.
I wonder if it was like the unemployment systems or the
it was something exactly. It was something exactly like that because of with COVID and the applications for the PPP stuff and all that. Like it was exactly that. And so you never know, that stuff's still around.
So I want to talk about your time at Microsoft, but I want to make sure I understand on the timeline. When did you start creating music?
So the latter part of my time there, so I would say in any, I mean, I dabbled in lots of ways, because some of the initial stuff I did at Microsoft was in the multimedia team. So I'd always had some, sort of relationship to music and multimedia and things like that. But putting that aside, in terms of really, seriously making art of my own, that was probably in the about 2010-ish kind of time frame. So close to, I left Microsoft in 2012 to start Brick Lane Records, and so it was sort of like a 2 or 3 years before that, I kind of really gotten into making my own stuff, which really took me another level of depth in terms of connecting with the artistic community here in Seattle, which is a big part of the story towards doing what sort of we're doing now, is connecting with that community, starting that label, learning a ton about sort of the music industry and how it impacted people in that community, and wanting to find more ways to help. But I started at Microsoft in '92.
Okay, wow. So that's an amazing, not only the longevity of the run, but from a product point of view, really around the first versions. Like what version was Windows on? 3.1.
It's kind of so I started at the time it was called Cairo, which was it was essentially the next major version of NT before the first major version of NT shipped. So Windows NT, as they were working on it, as Cutler and folks, they were working on it and so on. There's another team working on what would be sort of this sort of leapfrog, very object oriented. It was at the time. Do you remember when Next was around and
oh yeah, of course,
right, that kind of thing, right? So a lot of the thinking around object oriented operating systems, right, and object file systems and distributed file systems, which that was the team that was in. I was in the distributed systems team, and working on things like replication and stuff like that. Those were sort of the kind of like far out product things that we were working on to then come on after we had this new platform in NT as the core. And so that's the team I was in. At the same time, of course, Microsoft was about to sort of hit this big turn that happened with things like Win95 and stuff like that. And so,
yeah. So 92 would have been like, I guess, towards the tail end of like the first successful version of Windows.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then when 95, sort of took it, skyrocketed,
Yeah. And so, which I guess begat XP and sort of
so at the same time, there was this other team working on Windows NT, which was a whole new kernel engine infrastructure for building out our operating systems and would become the core of what, sort of Microsoft operating systems were to be. And so that was just this sort of parallel track.
Did you ever use or come into contact in person with an XQ?
No, I did not.
Yeah, I can't imagine many people have.
I wish I had. It's one of those things everybody was like, oh man, I want to see one of these things. I want to touch it myself. Not just read press things about it and all that, but I didn't get a chance to. So
I remember.
I'm sure somebody has one just sitting around somewhere now.
Oh, there's got to be a few floating around Seattle.
Yeah.
Paul Allen had a few. It's funny. I can remember more than anything else about that company. I remember the trade ads and sort of the just like the computer porn of those ads. They were so beautiful. But I never. Right. I don't think
post-script rendering and stuff like that. It's just like
Yeah, I've never knowingly met anybody that played with one. Yeah, it's amazing. And so the core of that platform became iOS, right? That was ultimately when Jobs came back to Apple, they took the next operating system, and that's when they blew out like System 7 and all that. They because Apple at that time through the early 90s were having such legacy problems with their OS.
Yeah, they certainly were. I mean, ultimately, I wasn't in the team, so I couldn't tell you like how much of sort of one thing survived into the next as such. You know what I mean? Like the no pun intended. Having built large systems and run teams building large systems, what may seem like a straightforward path from the outside in terms of like, oh yeah, they brought in this thing and so they must have just thrown away this other stuff and like just started here. But it's usually not as simple as that. You know what I mean? Especially when you have existing customers and compatibility you have to think about, and migrating developers to new platforms you have to think about and things like that. And pragmatic considerations in terms of like, well, there's some pieces of code in that thing that work pretty well, and we know how it works and how compatible it is. So maybe we'll bring some of that over here and put it together with some over here.
Yeah. I mean, the notion of developing. I mean, for either of the companies, for Apple or for Microsoft operating system, and having to support all those legacy enterprise people, and really only one.
Spades,
and I think only every 10 or 15 years or so are they really sort of allowed to press the reset button and say, this is a hard migration that everybody better do by X date.
That's right.
It's incredible. So,
and Apple's going through another interesting one on that too, right? Like with the move back away from Intel chips, there's a whole conversation like that that's happening again. And that's fascinating when you think about how many iOS devices are out there. How do they pull that off? Do they have to fork the operating system? Well, I mean, I think the most of the conversation has been centered on the Mac OS and Mac laptop platform. Kind of like that. In terms of the chipset migration. The iPhone and iPad have been on sort of Apple Silicon already for a little while now, and so or some degree of that. But all of their sort of desktop stuff, that's where they're moving. I believe that's where that conversation is centered.
And do you understand, or could you help me understand why? What's the genesis of that decision? What's the benefit to Apple of doing that? It was such a big deal when they went to Intel. Is it simply a supply chain issue, or?
There's certainly some of that, right? Sort of bringing everything under their control, sort of allows them to develop an innovation strategy and timeline that is much better, sort of understood and aligned with everything else they're doing. So that's one thing, right? One of the things that is painful, and for many companies is when the core of something they're building like has to wait on somebody else before they can innovate in a particular way. Putting that aside, I think there are some practical considerations from a technical viewpoint about, power consumption and so on. And, so integration, like you'll find that, I would say in the history of software and platforms, that you'll find this kind of, call it bundling and unbundling that happens in many spheres, right? And, the advantage you get when you have something completely vertically integrated is that you can move things forward, right? Innovation forward in a pretty fast way. But of course, you lose the sort of plug and play, ecosystem benefits that you might get otherwise. And depending on what phase of your cycle you're in, one path might be more attractive than the other. But Apple has been clearly over time building, this capacity for taking that type of thing under their own control for a while now. And so, it may simply be that they looked at all of the pros and cons and the corresponding things that the ecosystem would have. Like you can argue that now, a big thing that would stop you from doing things like that is the idea of compatibility issues. Like, are your customers going to have access to applications and things like that? And they have a bit of a path there now because they've built up a whole ecosystem of applications that people could use, given the App Store and the App Store platform and so on. So without being in the room with the team, I'm sure there are plenty of things that went into that decision, but that's some of the stuff that I imagine.
So it sounds like a part of what you're saying is that it's an acknowledgement that the hardware and the software development and innovation are even more sort of interconnected than before.
Oh, sure.
It's not simply a platform to build on there.
Sure, yeah. And it's that, depending on what your goals are and what phase you're in, right? So if you take Microsoft, for instance, right? Essentially, Microsoft commoditized hardware. And you can get certain kinds of innovation by doing so, right? But at the same time, you take on a lot of legacy, especially as you get to a certain scale. And it depends a lot on what your customers are expecting from you in terms of innovation. At Microsoft, we had a fundamental belief that, the innovation was in the software, right? The hardware, especially with Moore's Law, the hardware would continue to provide a platform for us to do more and more interesting things in software. But if you look at today's world, with phones or iPads, et cetera, and requirements around power and innovations you want to have in cameras and on and on and on, there's more integration than that. And so Apple has tried to benefit from, sort of a vertical integration across the board so that they could do something new. And it is a mix, right? Like if you think about what they did with the 10 series, right, and the camera, right? It's this kind of interesting mix of hardware and software innovation that gives you this, sort of great leap forward in terms of capture, right? And intelligent capture, right? And so, it just depends. It depends on your worldview and what stage you're at. Clearly, Apple has gone back and forth, right?
Yeah. When they say they're moving to an Apple chip or an Apple chipset, does that they're literally in the fabrication business now? Or is somebody designing
there's certainly
their spec?
I suspect I guess I should start by saying I couldn't tell you accurately. Like I don't know how much of the pipeline they're doing themselves, like for Apple employees versus what parts are outsourced and how closely they're outsourced, like companies that are like this or companies that are like sort of at more arm's length. My suspicion is that they have a team that is doing chip design, certainly. And insofar as that chip design has some modularity, maybe there are parts that are commodity that they say. So it's likely that the stuff for networking, for instance, they probably pick up a sub-module from somewhere, some trusted, provider, and say, okay, we're going to just rely on that because we're not trying to innovate there. There's a bunch of standards out there on that. Insofar as those standards move forward, or we help push those standards forward, that's fine. But that's not where we're going to spend team time. So it's probably some mix, but I would say that they probably have quite a bit of overall system architecture and chip design that's in-house. But I couldn't tell you for certain.
Yeah. Given the capital expenditure to fire up a fabrication plant, there's only a handful of companies that are probably truly capable of it, and with their cash position, I would think. Oh
yeah, they can certainly do a lot with their cash position. It's just a matter of whether how far down the pipeline they feel it makes sense to control. They're of course notoriously close, they keep things close to their chest. And to do that, you want to keep a certain amount of stuff in-house. But, they've managed to be successfully close to the chest with a lot of stuff, even when they were working with Intel on things, right? I think they've done a good job of impressing on companies how much that is a core value for them, right? So I think few people are willing to cross them on that,
Yeah. When you were at Microsoft, it seemed there was a large portion of your time there that was focused on media related products.
Yeah. Do you remember Real Jukebox?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So do you remember when Microsoft first came out with a version of the Windows Media Player that had CD ripping and the media library and that kind of thing? I wrote a lot of that stuff. Yeah, that was me and my team. Yeah. So it was kind of back in those days. I did a lot of multimedia work on the client, on the server. I did a lot of multimedia server work as well. It was good times, media platform stuff.
It's so funny to talk to people that were around during that era and all of the sort of like the island of lost formats, whether it was Liquid Audio or
Liquid Audio.
Remember 8B, the loosened AT&T format? That was supposed to be that and Liquid Audio were the audio file of the day.
Exactly.
Yeah, all sort of one fell swoop. The MP3 world just wiped.
That's right.
That whole thing away. So when you were developing, were you thinking about cross-platform or interoperability, or were you primarily like, this is a Windows application? How did you think about
that? In those days, putting aside, the stuff that you would typically do around networking and network protocols, which, you have a certain thinking about interoperability there. It was pretty much building, Windows clients, Windows servers, that kind of stuff. But, I have at various points in my career, thought fairly significantly about, cross-platform, particularly actually in the latter part, where I was running, parts of the Office mobile infrastructure, because I worked on mobile productivity for a while as well. At a time when, for instance, Microsoft thought about doing productivity stuff with Nokia and so on. And so I've definitely thought both in terms of very Windows specific stuff as well as, sort of cross-platform, which cross-platform comes with its own unique challenges.
Yeah. Towards the end of your tenure, did I read correctly that you were deeply involved in the whole Nokia?
Yeah. So from the Office / business division side, which actually is where the first sort of connection with Nokia came, was that Microsoft and Nokia got into an agreement to bring some of the Office mobile technology and applications to the Nokia platform. And when we did that deal, I was working for the guy who was the president of the business division as his technology advisor. And he ultimately actually went on to run Nokia. And so I was the technical lead on sort of putting that part of that deal together, which was fairly complex transaction, 100+ page contract kind of thing. And so a lot to it.
Yeah. And so what brings you to the end of your time at Microsoft? I mean, you had an incredible run through an amazing shift in not only desktop, but, connected technologies, the shift to mobile, working, the whole media and streaming landscape explodes. Like, you're right there at all these interesting things. Were the big problems solved for you, or was
no? There's still plenty of problems to solve. No, not at all. Like, I think, for me, what happened is that, at that point, like around, sort of coming towards, sort of 2011, 2012, I was on a natural crossroads. And, that saying is that, professionally, we were coming to the end of a major release cycle for the Office set of products. And so it was a natural time to think about, okay, well, what am I going to do next? I was also professionally coming to, sort of 20 years being at Microsoft, right? And so that's kind of a milestone that you think, okay, well, all right, well, what am I going to do next there? I was also personally about to turn 40, so I kind of was like, oh, well, okay, what I want to do there, I also had, sort of in 2010 had come out of a divorce. And so I was also kind of, that, in some sense, coming out of that is what really triggered me going really deep on making art and making music as a way to work through, a lot of emotional stuff. And so it was really like, at this crossroads of a lot of different, things. And it felt like a really natural step to say, okay, well, why don't I go take a right turn, and at the time where I was considering that, I had gotten, really connected to this community of artists, and I saw, like, I don't know if you remember around, and I'm sure you do actually, given what you've done in your life and career, around 2011, 2012 was sort of the bottom of the trough of the last major disruption to the music industry, out of which sort of the phoenix of streaming came, rose from the ashes, right? And what I'd been seeing is that, a disproportionate impact of that disruption was being felt by the independent community. And that, sort of, in empathizing with those artists and those, sort of micro labels and the people really trying to do beautiful music, high quality music, diverse music, and just trying to get access to opportunity I haven't heard. I thought, well, what's a way I can help in this context at a time where I was thinking about doing something different anyway. And so out of that came the desire to start, Brick Lane Records. That took me into a whole different chapter.
Well, yeah, and please, I need to hear about this. So Brick Lane as a business entity, and what does Brick Lane do that's different than another record label, if anything? Sure. And yeah, was a goal of Brick Lane to innovate in any way, or was it simply about providing a platform?
It was very much about innovating in that, at the time, it's really interesting to watch this arc now, but at the time, the idea that you would come at a label and the principles for creating a label and thinking, okay, what is it that I can do for artists that treats them as a true business entity that you want to create a platform for them to succeed more so than you're trying to create a platform for you to do your own business, right? If you think about the history of music, right, is littered with people creating value for themselves at the expense of artists, right? The really, really, sort of old history.
That might be the definition of the recorded music business.
right. And so I kind of came at it thinking, okay, well, we're going to try to create something that feels like a collective, that feels like a family, and that the principles around which we built the terms, because we wanted to actually be, on the up and up in terms of how we set up the terms and treated artists, would start with the idea that, this is an investment, not a loan. So when we set up a budget for an artist for a project, we would say, hey, look, you don't have to pay through this. You don't have to recoup through this in order to see revenue. This is us investing you, much in the same as, an investor might invest in a startup business, right? And that right there, that in itself changes the whole dynamic, right? You're now partners, truly partners, right? Then you say, okay, well, the splits are always going to be artist majority, right? And then you say, you're not locked in. If you do this project with me, and if you want to do your next project with somebody else, I will be happy to help you do it better with somebody else, right? And then you continue kind of building on those kinds of principles, right? And you have something very, very different for 2011, 2012 as a time frame. It's much more powerful, of course, now when you think about modern label services, right? To have things where artists have much more leverage and can get friendlier terms. But back then, that wasn't the case. I remember negotiating with the legal team for what's probably the more successful act that we had on the label, in that, he did his first record with us and then went on to do, and is in the sort of closing parts, I think, of the cycle of the second record, which was done on French Kiss. And he, got his publishing picked up by Communion. Negotiating with his management team's legal folks, at one point they said, hey, so are you guys a nonprofit? because they were so confused about why our
not
terms,
intentionally.
not intentionally. I was like, we just think this is how we should treat the artists, kind of thing. And that's how, sort of different, our value system was at the time. And so I do feel like we innovated.
Can't think of another way to say it, so I'll just ask it.
Say it.
Can a label survive financially in that model, or is making money not something you need the label to do?
It's a very fair question. It is difficult, but I think I think that difficulty may have had less to do with the principles, right? Which, and more to do with what was of a changing environment. So much was changing in the way, in terms of music, right? So, how people valued music was changing, right? So, when you think about that shift from, what was a fairly high margin thing about selling CDs to, a whole different proposition in terms of streaming and all that, it's just the business was changing anyway under you, right? If you are an independent, and this is really difficult for independent labels coming up, right? You need time to sort of build that catalog and that infrastructure that allows you to then, rely on some catalog, right, to kind of keep you going, right, in some way, and to find opportunities to actually capitalize on that catalog, right? That you need time, and so in some ways it's capital intensive to get started, right? In that way, as much as there are many things, many kind of pieces of infrastructure that make it easier to get started, like you can do your distribution through a TuneCore, or you can a DistroKid, and all those things make it easier. But the patience required and the searching for opportunity, and this is where I would say getting into SyncFloor came out, is that when you look at sort of what access to opportunity is, when the amount of music that's out there is so large, right? 50 million commercial tracks on Spotify, 40,000 tracks a day being uploaded, right? You're now trying to be seen and heard, in a vast sea of stuff, right? Which requires even more patience to try to distinguish yourself, right? To be signal from noise, right? And so that, all those things I think make it really difficult to bootstrap as a small independent label. We were actually fortunate in some sense in that, we kind of took the typical kind of little steps. Our first step was we after signing the first artist, Iskadov, we put out a couple of small things, got connected via a friend at KEXP to a good radio publicist, right? When those things were interesting, right? That got us at least some first kind of momentum, and enough momentum on some radio stuff. Not a big revenue momentum thing, but just enough, sort of perception momentum, if you want to call it, to then be able to have a conversation with a publicist, right? Who then could get you a little bit more momentum that, now you could have an interesting conversation with a distributor, which at the time, we ended up being distributed by In Grooves. You get involved with a distributor that has some weight that lets you get in front of, the retail outlets, and you sort of build things. And at every step that you go, the next person looks at you as quote unquote more real, right? If you're like, oh, I'm distributed by, my publicist is, my publishing admin is, and so you just keep kind of building.
It's a lot of social proof basically along the way.
A lot of social proof, right? But that stuff takes time. It takes a lot of time, and so fortunately I could afford to at the time, take the time, and my motivation was primarily, how do I give these artists a platform? So, as long as we were graduating people to some next thing, then that was great.
Yeah, it's the way you describe it, it's both for your business and any individual artist project. It's a series of iterative storytelling.
That's right.
There's an initial story. You add to the story as you go along. The story changes and grows and develops, and you're always prepping the story for the next person to hear it and the next step of the process.
That's right.
Yeah. So in your story, tell me about SyncFloor. So how does that fit into your sort of, into Brick Lane and your business ecosystem, as well as into your larger sort of philosophical or worldview? Sure.
Well, I mean, it's in some ways it's a natural outgrowth. There's something that. So first of all, the reason that SyncFloor came into being is because with Brick Lane, we had a significant amount of time to look at the music industry and kind of observe where sort of archaic and arcane processes again disproportionately impacted the access to opportunity for the independent community that we cared about. Looking at Sync in particular just happened to be like a vertical that we thought, oh, okay, well, Sync is a really interesting revenue opportunity, and I think people have underestimated and undervalued the revenue opportunity there as something that is now being driven significantly by a new golden age in video, right? So, as the lingua franca for people in entertainment and education and brand marketing and on and on and on, right? All forms of storytelling, right? Video is the future, podcasting notwithstanding. Podcasting is also, to some degree, a great new media thing. And in fact, it's really interesting to watch a lot of these podcast production companies talking about optioning things to TV. But looking at all of this stuff, you say, okay, well, that's going to naturally drag in this requirement for music, right? And if you could take a bunch of the fear and friction out of the processes that are there, you can really unlock a whole new realm of commerce. So that's the story, that's the narrative that you want to talk about in terms of the large opportunity that makes this interesting to go after with a startup, something that people want to have venture scale opportunity for. But when I looked at it, I kind of said, well, in terms of philosophy, what I can do here is do something that can unlock access to opportunity for the independent sector, where the fragmentation in the independent sector is working against it, right? So, if I'm a production professional trying to find, sort of music to lift my creative, right? Then, when I think, okay, the independent sector is where all this great music with great creative vision and artistic integrity and brand equity and so on, that's where that stuff lives, right? Really, that's where it lives. But who do I call? Where do I, how many independent labels and micro labels and so on are out there? How do I get in touch with any of them? I might be living across the street from somebody who has the perfect piece of music for what I'm doing, but I'd never know about it, right? And so that fragmentation kind of says, okay, well, if you could do something to create accessibility to that and have that accessibility be really focused on the creative, right? Not on the Rolodex, not on the who but on the creative, then, you could then say that, small micro label over in, Phoenix, right, stands just as good a chance if they've got the right stuff as, major independent sitting in Seattle, or frankly, a major sitting in New York, right? And so that's kind of.
So functionally, what is SyncFloor and how does it work?
So SyncFloor is first and foremost a marketplace for commercial music for use in productions, film, TV, advertising, podcasting, and all of those things. We come at it particularly around the independent sector in that we aggregate lots of interesting catalog and provide accessibility to it. And the way we think about that accessibility is in sort of three pillars. The first pillar is around what we think of as professional discovery. That's the front door. How do you dig through the crates in a way that's productive and joyful, right? And the core piece of insight that we had was that production professionals have a creative language that they use to specify what it is that they want for their production from the perspective of music. That language is much more in the realm of very natural expression. I'm looking for something, thoughtful, indie folk, like, feels maybe like Sufjan Stevens with strings. I'm looking for something that feels like Apocalypse Now. I'm looking for something that has the vibe of This American Life. And, I'm looking
almost
for something
keyword driven in a way.
Well, it's not just purely keywords, but we think of it as natural language music search, right? It's as if you and I are talking, and I'm trying to tell you, oh, this is kind of what I want it to feel like. And when we do that, we use words that are sentiment like. So if I said dreamy, in the context of music, you'll think in terms of a certain kind of tempo. It's
sentiment's a much better word,
right?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you say sentiment, but you also say references, and those references could be artist references, they could be song references, they could be cultural references.
Yeah.
And so our insight was that, well, if you could let those people say those things into your system at where you meet them where they are in terms of their creative language, and your job is to interpret that and bring back in real time options that match that creative, and more importantly, have a lot of transparency as to why you did the matchmaking, because humans will apply all sorts of extra context to continue iterating and digging through the crates. If you give them the information they need, then you have something very different and to some degree magical for people. And so that was the first pillar, this idea of what we think of as professional music discovery. The second pillar was that if you look at productions have become more and more complicated, right? The bar for creating productions goes up and up. And so you have all these teams of people bringing expertise and creativity to the table. And you need systems that allow for collaboration around productions. And modern software is really built around that notion. If you think about the things that people think of as really successful modern pieces of software that are around productivity and the future of work, they think about things that allow for great communication and collaboration around assets. A great example in the production realm is something called Frame.io. They're kind of like the Slack of video and video production. And the idea is that if you come at it from this modern software perspective, you start to think in terms of workflow. So, okay, I've done a search, I found some stuff, I want to gather it up, I want to organize it, I want to share it with other people, I want to party on the same folder as we discuss which ones we think we like, I want to be able to download the stuff and put it into a temp for edit, and I want that to be a direct process. I don't want to have to go emailing back and forth to get access to the instrumental if I need that, and things like that. You start to really think, okay, well, how do we create an environment where people can work like that and work together like that really seamlessly? And so that was the other kind of pillar that we kind of look at, is modern workflow and collaboration. And then finally, we said that, one of the big things that creates fear and friction in the system today around licensing music for all these different types of media uses is frankly the drama of clearance. And if we could take the drama out of clearance, make it hassle-free, we could do something interesting. And what we relied on there is that, the trend is for people to figure out how to consolidate rights. Then the rights regime in music can be very complex. But that complexity is now, there's like sort of a return force that people are starting to say, well, how do I consolidate things, right? Labels are becoming publishers are becoming labels, and things like that, because they're trying to consolidate. And so what we've done is we've said, we are going to focus on one-stop music. One-stop meaning one entity can represent or controls the rights around the entire thing, both sides, both the master side and the composition side. And in doing so, we now give ourselves the opportunity to let software be the broker and the framework for buyers and sellers, to one buyer and one seller, to have a conversation, right? Once you get there, it's much, much easier to take the drama out of it, right? And so those are the pillars we come at it from, and people are responding to that because they're like, this finally, somebody's come back at this problem and thought about it end to end, right? And this is the way I want to work. This is the future of sync. And so that's what we've done. We've taken it a step further, relevant to what we're doing now, podcasts, is we said, hey, look, in certain spheres, especially in these new media spheres, you have people coming at this desire to license music without a bunch of the baggage of how it works today. They're just like, I don't know, it's a piece of music, I want to get it, right? And so if you could actually then take the same platform that we have today in SyncFloor and configure it in a way that the language and the presentation is really optimized for a vertical, right? And you take all the knobs away that aren't relevant, and you customize the workflows, and you use the language that person understands, you could do even more to unlock commerce, especially at prices that are lower than the typical thing in video production, which is where you need the efficiency then, if you're going to scale, right? And so that's where we launched, actually, at the same time that we recently launched SyncFloor itself, we launched something called Songs for Podcasters. And the idea is that this is a sister site that's basically the same platform, but sort of reconfigured, specifically speaking to you, the podcast producer, and how you might want to more effectively get access to music by real artists with real creative vision and artistic integrity for your podcast productions, and at prices that make sense for what you're doing, and with a workflow that asks the questions that are in the language of somebody doing podcasting. And so that's what we built.
Oh, that's a very interesting sort of use case or application for the platform.
Thanks.
What's the state of the business today? Like, where are you at? Are you a MVP? Are you at Series A? Like, just in that life cycle, where are you?
So we just recently commercially launched. We're definitely before Series A. We're kind of pre-seed, and sort of heading towards seed is the way to think about it. Essentially, we did a friends and family raise in spring of 2018. And that's maybe I'll do this by stepping back and explaining the narrative of the company.
Yeah, please.
At a high level. And we incorporated in March 2017. sort of, and to add a little color to that background, in late 2016, I was finishing a tour, and my last stops were San Francisco and Oakland. And so I drove there myself, I took all my equipment, the typical like small indie outfit thing, and I do sort of industrial synth poppy like stuff. So I've got a whole rig of stuff that I'm kind of dealing with. Unfortunately, that drive and lugging around stuff shot, my back was shot by the time I came back. And so I was kind of laid up, sort of for the last part of 2016, heading into 2017. And so a lot of the thinking that had been kind of going on in the back of my head and discussing with, my co-founder and stuff like that, I kind of said, well, I'm just kind of sitting around here anyway, and so I started typing some code and, playing around, that kind of thing. And got to a point where I thought, no, there's something here. And so we incorporated in March 2017. It took us from that point over a year to get the core technology right. Because it's a very hard problem, that sort of search engine problem for taking a natural expression, even in the music sphere, and spitting out something that you could then do matchmaking on content with. But we got there and we said, okay, we have something interesting. And so then the next step, having raised that friends and family round in spring 2018, was to go try to create a credible, sort of catalog of content that you could, use as a backdrop to see if the matchmaking made sense. And so, so we started doing that, and that's a lot of footwork. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, of course, we, as having had deep experience in technology and deep experience running a label, meant that we have really strong founder market fit, right? We have credibility to go talk to people about a deep technical problem and a deep music business problem. And so did that for about a year, and then in sort of late summer 2019, raised some money from sort of 3 Northwest VCs with the idea that we'd use that to head towards a commercial launch. And in late last year, actually, we were accepted into an accelerator in New York that was focused on audio and that type of thing, and raised some additional funds there. And so all of that was sort of the part of the funding narrative arc. But of course, the getting the thing out the door was disrupted in many ways by what's been happening in various spheres of our world, and for me personally, with that, having a son. And from there, we only just recently actually did our commercial launch, like in this month. so
congratulations.
So we got the thing over the hump, and so now the real work begins.
You had 2 births in
two births.
Yeah. So what's the initial go-to-market? Are you seeding it out to people who need music as well as trying to aggregate more rights?
Yeah, so on the sell side, we continue our kind of and having put something out there, we're starting to get people coming to us and saying, how do we get involved and things like that. We have a fairly strong value proposition for independence, right? It's a non-exclusive 10% low transaction fee type thing. They don't do much in terms of what they have to give us. They give us ISRCs and assets, essentially. And then we build out this really rich description of their catalog and come back to them and say, here you go, here's your rich description. You can use it to mine your catalog yourself. Here's a storefront that you can actually put on your thing. For this full meal deal thing. And all those things are for free because we're just trying to encourage creating an ecosystem. And we win when they win. We get money when they get money, kind of thing is the principle. On the buy side, which is where we're focused now, we've started with a lot of sort of classic business development, feet on the ground, talking to creative agencies, ad agencies, production companies, film folks, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, a lot of that is about just building meaningful relationships right now because the production pipeline has gone dry to some degree, right? Because nobody's getting permits to shoot anything, right? That's starting to change a bit now, but the pandemic was a huge disruptor for that pipeline, which means it's a huge disruptor for the post-production pipeline, which means music licensing goes down, right? So there's sort of that type of thing that we're kind of working through. But what we said is that, hey, insofar as people now have the mental bandwidth, right? Because usually in production you're kind of running all the time, and so now they have some mental bandwidth to step back and say, well, okay, what is the future of my work? What's the future of my work in a post-pandemic world? And so we kind of are like, hey, here we have a big part to play in that. and they have the space to have the conversation. And we can build the meaningful relationships that mean that when things pick up, they're like, oh yeah, those guys, right? And so that's kind of part of what we're doing now. There will be, of course, the typical thing where you go and you sort of advertise and sort of put yourself out there, where you've developed some core messages. For us, those core messages are real music, not stock. Real music from real artists. The professional music discovery that's intuitive. The modern collaboration and workflow. Hassle-free clearance. All those things, we're putting it together in a way that kind of makes for a clear message. Then, what we've done with Songs for Podcasters is something that we're kind of going to double down on, because we feel like we've touched a nerve, right? People have been clamoring for a way to get at this kind of music that feels simple, that feels fear-free, and things like that. And now what we want to do is we want to find those pockets of podcast creators and producers. Typically, I believe by approaching the podcast hosting platforms and trying to figure out how to work with them to get at their creator communities, right? Essentially, look at affiliate relationships and things like that, and really kind of try to drive, sort of traffic from that way.
And how far up the creator spectrum do you see? What's the audience or the addressable market for creators who would have their content available to be licensed? Do you hit a certain threshold even in the indie community where they have other outlets that are like,
people have choices, but I think people are seeing that we're doing something interesting and innovative, and we're unlocking new verticals, right? Starting with this podcasting thing, and our discovery is so rich, right? Like, if you're an independent, right, to have your stuff show up high up in a set of results simply because it matches the creative is really a whole different kind of access to opportunity that's not dependent on the Rolodex. Now, we have a problem that we have to solve still, which is that right now, as a startup that has to focus on, okay, well, what can we do and what can we scale initially? We focused a lot on the independent community, but micro labels, small independent labels, distributors, small publishers, that kind of thing. Because what we found is that as a unit of curation, right, it's a little easier for us to scale in terms of our ingestion pipeline, saying, okay, let's talk to you, Mr. Label, and pick up a batch of stuff from you, right? Versus a whole lot more, sort of individuals. We have a few individuals in the index, but for the most part, we've been, focused initially on these businesses. And then the other thing that we found, which is actually maybe the sort of higher mountain to scale, but one again that we're committed to over time figuring out how to do so, is that the businesses on the other side, the production professionals, the companies, the agencies, etc., that are looking for music tend to want a business on the other side who's standing up for the reps and warrants for the thing they're licensing, right? And so you have this thing where they're like, okay, well, I want to lead with creative, but ultimately when I go through this process that's your hassle-free clearance, I also want to make sure that the person on the other end is trusted. And they're more likely to trust at least an entity, a business entity, that might over time have access to E&O insurance and things so you get into this problem where you're like, okay, well, I have to encourage my ecosystem to sort of be structured enough that this kind of works for the buyers too. Having said that, I think that there are sort of, call it, partitions of a marketplace where you could even have individuals talking to individuals, but that's something that I think we get to in the future.
One last question about this. It's just a nuts and bolts one that I can't help but be curious about. How do you scale the ingestion? Is it a machine learning or is it people?
Philosophically, and given where our taxonomy came from, and so I may give a slightly long form answer to this, which I guess has been typical in our conversation.
Well, no, the taxonomy is a question I'm glad you're addressing it, because I was thinking, wow, this sounds a bit like the Genome Project or things of that nature.
No, I get it. And so here's where it kind of differs. So what I consider to be a core piece of insight that we had was that if you're going to go after this natural language music search problem, in building a taxonomy, you have a couple of ways you could go about it. A very typical way of building taxonomies around music is to build it bottoms up, right? You think, how do I describe music, right? This music has like, a key and a specific BPM and on and on. You kind of build out things that way. And you can be very sophisticated there. I'm not disparaging that approach as such. That in fact, we have elements of that approach as well. But sort of our core insight was that, what if we took and analyzed a ton of the requests for music from the buy side, from the production side? So we took 1,000 of these briefs that people are sending around an email or talking to each other about and stuff like that. We analyzed the conversation, if you want to call it that. And we said, what if we use that to drive what the taxonomy was? That we were trying to make sure that we could most richly express what it is that people were saying from the production side. And then we'd figure out how to describe the music, right, in that taxonomy that you derive from that direction, right? And when you do that, you start to lean a lot more in the thematic direction. And you lean much more in things that you may say, look, you know what? For the most part, sometimes a producer might be talking about stuff in terms of a specific BPM, but a lot of times they're talking about it at a high level tempo and feel, which we all know that, especially in today's world, somebody might, leave their DAW set at, 120 BPM or something, but the feel of the thing is different, right? Depending on what they're doing in percussion or whatever, on and on and on. We kind of lean really into this idea that we have to describe the feel, right? And the taxonomy is rich in its methodology for describing it. So having gone down that route, what that then says is that your ingestion pipeline naturally has a combination of algorithmic and human. You kind of have to, at least. And now what you can do is you can make your pipeline more and more sophisticated and more efficient, so you can scale what you bring in and how fast you can bring it in. But you do have some element of both these things. Now, the good news for us is multifold, but I prioritize these things. One, when we looked at the space of content that we need to ingest and what scale we need to get to on the catalog side, the aggregate catalog side, what we realized is we're like, oh, we don't have to have 50 million tracks. Our proposition isn't that of a streaming service like Spotify or Pandora. We don't have to have all the tracks, because the consumer will just say, you don't have all the tracks, I'm just not going to subscribe to you. I'll subscribe to the guy that has all the tracks. What we need to have is enough scale of enough diversity of content and enough diversity of price point based on diversity of partners, right, to satisfy a significant portion of the requests, right? And that we realized is much more in the six figures. Like if you get to the point, right? If you get to the point where you have 100,000, 200,000 tracks in an index with the right diversity of both type and price point, then you're a cobalt. You know what I mean? In terms of weight, gravitational force, right?
Yeah, and it may not be a great analogy, but it is similar to Pandora in that they're more like 1 million or 2 million tracks in any given month.
It is. And but I think it hurts them more from the perspective of competing against a Spotify, right? Because the proposition is just different there. What a consumer is expecting, right? There's a baseline that's different, right? A production professional is just like, I just care about my project. I just want to find something that's great for that, right? And so I'm not thinking that you should have the world of music, as long as you have the thing that I want.
That's right.
Kind of thing, right? So that's the one thing that we can lean on, is that we have to get to a different place, right? The other thing we can lean on is that as much as it might be harder at first, and we can certainly, there are places that I'm still like, I want to make our pipeline better from the ingestion perspective. But the fact of the matter is that you do it once and you're done. You know what I mean? You're just like, okay, great. And you're accruing value constantly, right? So it's not this thing where you're continuously refreshing it. So you're stuck, right? In terms of oh shoot, my pipeline isn't efficient and I have to do a pass on this thing every, a full pass on it, every month or something.
Yeah, that's a great point. There could be a certain, once you hit your scale of whatever that 6-figure number is, it's like a culling and replacing, or a culling.
Yeah, exactly. You're moving a window, right? Kind of thing. And so I think there are a number of structural things that are advantageous in the context of sync that allows us to then be maybe a little deeper and richer in terms of what we do, even if it's a little less efficient on the ingestion pipeline.
I love it. I'm sold.
And it truly is magic when you put the human side and the algorithmic side together, right? And you can do that on the ingestion pipeline. You can't, of course, do that in the real-time search part of it, but you put those things together and you can get real magic in terms of the kind of results that you can have.
So for the benefit of the audience, can you give me the SyncFloor and the podcast website URLs so we're 100% clear?
Absolutely. So it's syncfloor.com, syncfloor.com, and songsforpodcasters.com.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's certainly search friendly.
Search friendly.
I'm gonna give it a test run. I'm a fan from what I've heard. Thank you for your time. You allowed me to run over, and I want to be
fun conversation.
I can imagine you've got to take your rest breaks where you can get them as well these days.
Right. That's right. And I'm going up to take my shift now. I'm sure there's a diaper change waiting for me.
Thank you so much, Kirt Debique. Thanks to Ant Taylor and the entire team at Lyte. If you're interested in what we're up to at Lyte, visit us at lyte.com. And thank you for listening to Spotlight On. We're available from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere else that spits out podcasts. Spotlight On is produced and edited by Craig Snyder. Keep your feedback coming. Reach me directly at lp@lyte.com. Thank you so much. Be safe and stay in touch.